Jane loved visiting her grandfather. She always saw Charles Butler as the perfect example of an honest and just person. Jane's grandmother died 7 years ago, and ever since then, his granddaughter was the old man's closest person. Charles Butler's life wasn't an easy one. In his youth, he took part in one of the armed conflicts of the territory of Indochina. He carried the memories of the horrible things he experienced there through his entire life. After serving in the army, he got some training and became a jeweler. Charles was always attracted to the beauty of gold and diamonds, which seemed like true works of art to him. Charles achieved impressive success in this field and was considered one of the most talented specialists in his industry. Some people spread rumors that he was incredibly rich, but that wasn't true. Charles lived in an old house that was leaning to one side and looked nothing like a fairy tale castle full of treasures. Jane never thought that her grandfather was rich and didn't stay in touch with him to get money out of it. In the depths of her soul, the young woman felt sorry for the old man because all the other relatives turned their backs on him and all they cared about was the inheritance they would get after his death. Jane was disgusted by such an attitude towards the elderly man who found himself in such an unenviable position. The young woman felt it in her heart that her relatives thought that she had her eye on the old man's house and that it was the only reason she came to visit him, as part of her devious plan to get her inheritance. However, the truth was that Jane sincerely loved her grandfather and took care of him without expecting to get anything in return. That day, the young woman came to bring the old man food and meds. "Hello, Grandpa. How have you been? How are you feeling?" Jane asked from the doorway. Whenever his granddaughter came to visit, Charles perked up noticeably. It seemed that the wrinkles on his face smoothed out and his eyes shone with youthful enthusiasm. Jane was the only bright spot in Mr. Butler's life, the only reason that made him want to live and fight his illness. Nevertheless, Charles didn't want to lie to his granddaughter, and after a moment of hesitation, honestly replied, "I'm not doing too well. I think my time is coming. Nobody cares about me but you. You are the only person I have left." "Come on, Grandpa, don't bury yourself alive. You still have a lot of life left in you." Jane tried to encourage the old man, but there was no convincing Charles Butler. The old man felt that he was getting weaker by the minute. He knew that he didn't have much time left. For this very reason, Mr. Butler took Jane by the hand and led her into the garage. There he showed his granddaughter a tombstone which he'd ordered from a funeral home. "What is this?" Jane asked, getting nervous. "I bought a tombstone for my grave. It looks good, doesn't it? I don't want to be a hustle to anyone, so I made sure everything's ready for when my time comes," the old man explained. Tears welled up in Jane's eyes. Never in her life had she seen anyone be so considerate towards their relatives. She realized that her sick grandfather wanted to make sure that his relatives didn't have to worry about making funeral arrangements. Jane knew that most of his relatives were waiting for Charles's death in order to find out who would get the inheritance. Meanwhile, the young woman didn't even want to think about it and was hoping that her grandfather would live for as long as possible. It was for this reason that she came to visit Charles almost every day, regardless of the weather or anything else. Moreover, Jane always brought him food and medications. She also took it upon herself to help her beloved grandfather keep his house clean, as well as cook his food and even look after his garden. "You're spending too much of your time with me, honey. I'm sure you have a boyfriend. You should spend your time with him, not your old grandpa," the old man sighed. "I do have a boyfriend, but that doesn't mean I can't help you. First, I need to make sure that you have everything you need, and then I can spend time with my boyfriend," said Jane. Jane really did have a boyfriend. His name was Chris Brown. He was 25 years old, and he supported Jane in everything because he loved her with all of his heart. The young people had been dating for about 6 months and were already thinking about getting married. Although Charles Butler didn't personally know Jane's boyfriend, he had a good feeling about him because he saw how happy he made his granddaughter. Charles once had a great love in his life too, back when he was young. Unfortunately, it was a very long time ago and had nearly disappeared from the old man's memory. That day, Jane stayed at her grandfather's house until late. She usually went home at lunchtime, but that day she even stayed for dinner. As she was leaving, she wished her beloved grandfather good night and promised to come back the next day. If she could have only known what fate had in store for her. Unfortunately, Jane was never able to do what she promised because Charles Butler died 2 hours after she left. The news of her grandfather's death left Jane in a state of profound shock. She sincerely believed that her grandfather would get better, and now she was devastated. Quite expectedly, Jane was the one to take care of the funeral arrangements. First of all, that was because most of the relatives turned their backs on Jane when they learned that she was the one getting Charles's house. Some of them even openly bullied her for it. "I didn't do anything wrong. I simply took care of my elderly grandfather. Something each of them should have been doing," Jane said to her fiancé. Charles nodded understandingly and agreed with his girlfriend. The funeral and the wake didn't feel real to Jane. Even a week after the funeral, she still came to her beloved grandfather's grave every day. Looking at the tombstone with the small photograph in the center, Jane felt unbearable sadness. What made her especially sad was looking at the picture of her beloved grandfather on the tombstone. The picture was taken when he was still young and full of energy, enjoying his life and wealth. One day, as she came to visit the grave, Jane noticed something odd about the tombstone. The young woman's attention was drawn to the fact that the photograph attached to it had slid to one side for some unknown reason. "What's wrong with it? It was fine before," Jane thought to herself. The young woman came closer and tried to fix the photo. At that moment, Jane's fingers found a strange space behind the photograph. There, she found a tightly sealed envelope. "What's that?" Jane whispered in surprise. It was the first time she'd seen a hiding place like that. It appeared to have been made by her late grandfather. Burning with impatience, Jane opened the envelope and immediately checked its contents. The first thing she saw were a few pictures of her and her grandmother together. There was also a letter written by Charles Butler. There, the old man said that he was proud to have such a wonderful granddaughter and that she gave his life meaning. But that wasn't the most interesting part. There was also a strange piece of paper and a small key in the envelope. The piece of paper had a hand-drawn map on it. Looking more closely, Jane realized that it was a map of the house she'd just inherited from her grandfather. At first, the young woman didn't understand anything. The drawing seemed to be raising more questions than she could answer. But then Jane showed the map to Chris, and he immediately found what it was. "It's another hiding place. See that over there? It's marked with an arrow. This is the wall that passes through the basement," the man explained. When the young people followed the old man's instructions and found the right spot in the house, it turned out that finding the hiding place itself was a rather difficult task. It was only when Chris went down into the basement and started tapping on the wall that he managed to find the secret niche inside it. Having torn off the wallpaper, the young people saw a small safe. Apparently, the key that Jane found in the envelope behind the picture of her late grandfather's tombstone was supposed to open it. The safe was so skillfully built into the brickwork that it would have been impossible to find it without the clues from the map. "I bet this key will still open it," Jane exclaimed and carefully inserted it into the keyhole. There was a dull click and the door opened smoothly. When the young people looked inside the safe, they were shocked. It was filled to the brim with jewelry and precious stones. There were so many of them that Chris and Jane were literally speechless. As it turned out, Chris Butler spent his entire life putting together that treasure, also intending to leave it to whichever relative would treat him kindly in his old age. When Jane was taking care of her grandfather purely out of the goodness of her heart, he was sincerely happy that he had something to leave her in gratitude. The money and jewelry left by the old man were enough to not only repair the house, but also to open a small shop where Jane became both the seller and the owner. Now, Jane and Chris could seriously think about the wedding, because they had everything they needed for a happy family life. Moreover, Jane was sure that her late grandfather was watching her from heaven and would bless every step she took on her life journey.